Greetings, everyone. My name is Christiana Zenner. I am a professor of theology, science, and ethics at Fordham University in New York City. Though, like so many of us at present, I am working in a predominantly remote modality for the moment. I hope that all of you are well and that these clergy study days are some that are invigorating, thought-provoking, and spiritually and ethically renewing as well. It's an honor to be invited, so I thank the Archdiocese for the opportunity, the organizers, Ms. Jan Potts, for all of the technological support and logistical coordination, and again, I am delighted to be one among the cohort who is bringing a lecture to you for this event. I'm going to speak about a broad topic that is dear to my heart. That topic is science and tradition in Laudato Si and Catholic social teaching. I come to conversations about theology and science as someone who majored in human biology as an undergrad and who has a Ph.D. in religious ethics, focusing on the Catholic moral tradition. I am delighted to be able to teach as a Jesuit university in the present day, where the intersections of theological reflection and scientific discovery are both lively in overlapping ways. So it is my great pleasure to speak to you today about 4 distinct eras that I see in the Catholic Church's relationship with science that is contemporaneous at its time. And I will elaborate in this talk on each of what I see as those 4 eras. I will then spend a little bit of time drawing out some of the themes that have arisen in each of the 3 prior eras, the 3 earlier eras, with regard to what I see as the current 4th era, circling around Pope Francis and with seeds planted by John Paul II and Benedict XVI. I'll conclude this reflection set of remarks with a set of grounding observations, take-home messages, if you will, as well as a set of questions for you to consider as you go forward into your study. So let's begin. I think that while it is certainly fair to talk about the history of natural philosophy and the pursuit of wisdom in philosophical eras prior to the 16th century, it also makes a lot of sense to begin our explorations today with modernity. And by modernity here, I mean essentially the 16th century, the 1500s, 1600s, otherwise known as the era of astronomy and physics and the Church's developing relationship with that. Now, if you say the words science and the Catholic faith, you'll usually get a lot of strong reactions. Some people will look at you quizzically. Some people will say, well, that's an oxymoron. I get that one a lot. Some will say that they conflict. Some will say, oh, they're independent. They deal with different spheres. All of these might be true, may have been true at certain points in the past, may again be true in the future. But one of the precepts that I cleave to when thinking about these matters and teaching about them is that we can't talk about religion and science or theology and science in the abstract. We have to talk in the particular. What era? What geographic and political and historical and ecclesial context? What kind of science? Raising what sorts of methodological or theological questions? It's in that detail that the richness of the conversations or the debates between science and religion really take shape, and where we can really learn about the shape of theological reflection on contemporary science. So let's look at Galileo. Oh, Galileo. He was, of course, building upon the work of Nicholas Copernicus. Nicholas Copernicus had identified and only published right at the time of his death, posthumously, in fact, his work that argued that the Earth rotated around the sun. This view of heliocentrism contrasted the prevailing geocentrism of the time. The geocentrism of the time, 1542, and subsequently, built on the theories of Aristotle and Ptolemy, what was known as the Ptolemaic universe, the assumption that the sun rotated around the earth and seemed to be buffeted by scripture, which spoke in compelling and poetic ways about the sun rising and setting around the earth, moving around the earth. The Catholic Church, too, held this geocentric view, but Galileo, a Catholic, and by all accounts a very outspoken gentleman, agreed with Copernicus. He was condemned to house arrest in 1663 for his views. He landed, as we know, as history tells us, on the wrong side of the Catholic Church in that particular moment. We also know now that the 17th century Catholic Church got it wrong scientifically. The Earth does rotate around the sun, not vice versa. We live in a heliocentric cosmos. So as Pope John Paul said in 1992, when several centuries later he pardoned Galileo, theologians of the mid-16th century assumed that the literal sense of Scripture was an accurate description of natural phenomena. The church officials bristled at Galileo's heliocentrism, which seemed to contradict Scripture. But there's another ecclesial reality here, and that reality is the Counter-Reformation. So it is the case that church officials, Cardinal Bellarmine predominantly among them, were not only skeptical of Galileo's defense of heliocentrism, they were very cautious of and concerned about Galileo's moves to interpret Scripture out from under them. Because that, of course, is part of what the Protestant Revolution had precisely done. Take the authority for interpreting Scripture out of the hands of the magisterial church and put it in the hands of the individual believer, such that relationships were no longer mediated by the Catholic hierarchy. They were direct and sola scriptura, according to Scripture, according to the individual interpretation. In other words, the stakes were very high in Galileo's time, partly because of the inherited geocentric worldview, but partly because of ecclesial anxiety over authority. Who was allowed to interpret Scripture, to say how the world works or spins? Now, certainly, the punitive Catholic Church of the time is worthy of critique, as is the fact that it took several centuries for the Church to issue forth an apology. Yet, sometimes lessons are learned from history. Heliocentrism is now scientifically proven, not in question. Eventually, the Church acknowledged that Galileo was right about heliocentrism, but also crucially about something else. He, according to John Paul II, quote, also formulated important norms that are indispensable for reconciling Holy Scripture and science, end quote. Let me repeat that again. Galileo was not only right about the science of heliocentrism, says St. John Paul II, he also formulated important norms that are indispensable for reconciling Holy Scripture and science. The Catholic Church does not at present, nor has it for quite some time, defended biblical literalism. Biblical literalism is the view that Scripture, as received, has a direct, obvious meaning, that humans do not engage in any acts of interpretation, and that its meaning is obvious. In the context of natural history, this means, for example, that the Earth was created in 7 specific 24-hour days. This would mean a bevy of other things pertaining to the Galileo context that we just discussed. Biblical literalism is now predominantly the purview of much more fundamentalist evangelical Christian Protestant groups in the United States. It is not the purview of Catholicism. This is, in fact, an enormous theological strength of Catholicism. Now, this is a really, really important distinction that I want to make. The Catholic Church does not have a biblical literalist position on interpretation of the Bible. but it does cleave to the fact that there are revealed truths in the Bible. And those truths, those revealed truths about the nature of God, incarnation, the human person, those are not to be contradicted. This brings us to our next era, the second era that I want to discuss in terms of the Catholic Church's engagement with theology and science. And that is the 19th and 20th century developments in geology and biology. So second, geology and biology from the fossil record to geology, biology, and genetics. Where Galileo and his compatriots had turned their eyes to the heavens to ponder and reframe rotation and the Earth's place in the cosmos, British geologists and naturalists in the 19th century looked to the ground. As they excavated fossils and charted natural landforms into detailed maps, they realized that the Earth was likely to be much older than had previously been imagined. It was assuredly older than the, shall we say, back of the envelope, or perhaps tongue-in-cheek back of the Bible calculations based on scripture. In fact, prominent biblical interpreters in the 16th and 17th centuries had argued that the age of the Earth dated back to about 4000 BCE, 4000 BC, based on the dates provided in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and especially in the book of Genesis. Geologists, looking at the material evidence, at natural landforms, at the fossil record, at sedimentary records, geologists realized that was impossible. Biologists like Charles Darwin were influenced by these geologists, and so the biologists soon followed suit, pulling together information from the fossil record and looking at different species in their habitats, as well as doing mild experiments on controlled populations. Darwin realized that species did change over time. This had been a major question besetting many major thinkers and natural philosophers from the late 18th century on, and it was certainly on Darwin's mind. In fact, this, though, was a major change for Darwin himself. He had grown up in the Church of England in a world that was infused with, as we might say with Gerard Manley Hopkins, God's grandeur, and in a very specific way. In 1802, the Reverend William Paley had published a book called Natural Theology. This text reflected the then dominant view that species were permanent and inflexible, that they had been created specially so, perfectly poised, perfectly coiffed to the particular niche in which they were found. This was a very naturalistic, a very creation-loving stance that is also a version of the much older argument from design. What kind of God must we have, given how perfect and precise and intricate are the life forms that exist? That argument from design then took a particular shape prior to Darwin's time and in Darwin's time. And Darwin himself was drawn to this idea of special creation, that God had created every single species just so. Their particularity, their well-suitedness to the niche in which they lived was thought to be evidence of God's design. But Darwin's travels and study slowly brought him to a different conclusion. And he knew that this could potentially be theologically challenging. He knew that it could also be anthropologically challenging or morally challenging. If species evolve, and if humans are one kind of species on the earth, did that mean that humans also evolved? What does that mean for human uniqueness and for being created in the image of God? Where do we draw the line? Should we? Now, to be fair, Darwin did not comment on human beings when he published The Origin of Species in 1859. He had one line that dealt with human beings and evolution, and that said, "Much light will be thrown on man and his history." Nonetheless, the implication seemed clear to many Victorians. It caused major ethical and theological anxiety. If species evolved, then what role does God play in creation? Does anything make humans unique, or are we just glorified apes? Does religious morality based in Scripture have any traction in a world governed by natural laws, with a God who may be more remote from natural processes than people had previously imagined? These are tricky questions. These are still ongoing questions. There are fantastic thinkers in Catholic theology who are working on them and have been working on them for many years. Without going into too much detail about those, there are many ways, including some deeply Thomistic ways, informed by Aquinas, shaped through centuries of theological reflection, that see in the laws of nature God's creative working, God's infinite bounty and grace. But I'm sticking here to magisterial sources. And so what I will say is that the magisterial Catholic Church made no formal pronouncements on evolution until the mid-20th century. Now, there were, of course, individual Catholic priests and thinkers who pondered these questions, sometimes running afoul of the Catholic Church, receiving reprimands, formally or behind the scenes. Those are interesting and important stories. It was Pius XII, however, who decreed in 1950 that there's no inherent conflict between evolution and Catholic faith, as long as human uniqueness is maintained, as long as the creative action of God in generating the human soul, distinct for every individual, remains a theological act of special creation. A half century later, in 1996, John Paul II affirmed, reiterating this position, that evolution is more than merely a theory. This was in a 1996 address to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences that was pondering questions of evolution. The Church now officially recognizes that human beings' bodily form is the result of material evolution, but it cautions that the human soul does not have a material origin. Instead, the human soul remains a direct act of creation by God, the sole instance of ongoing special creation, if you will. Now, just as important is another statement that John Paul II made in the same address in 1996. Drawing on the legacy of Galileo, he said, "It is important to set proper limits to the understanding of Scripture, excluding any unseasonable interpretations. In order to mark out the limits of their own proper fields, theologians and those working on the exegesis of Scripture need to be well informed regarding the results of the latest scientific research." Theologians and those working on the exegesis of Scripture need to be well informed regarding the results of the latest scientific research. Again, that's John Paul II in 1996. And yes, it is the case that throughout the 20th century, the Church had become more open to and more explicit about its interpretive stance toward both Scripture and science. And by the mid-century and subsequently, the Church also turned to a new focused set of concerns, largely to do with technology, the promise and peril of large-scale nuclear technology, as well as the promise and peril of biotechnology. That brings us to the third era, the third set of topics for the Catholic Church and science, and this is the rise of nuclear technology and biotechnology. Third, the mid-20th century, the rise of nuclear technology and biotechnology. I will be the first to say that the acceleration of scientific knowledge and technological development in the 20th and now 21st centuries is vast, breathtaking, and frankly, dizzying. The past 100 years alone have seen the splitting of the atom, the specter of nuclear annihilation, the rise of quantum physics, the identification of DNA and methods of genetic manipulation, the power to fix nitrogen and amplify agriculture in attempts to feed a growing population globally, and modalities of surveillance and war that were unimagined until recently, not to mention the internet. In the mid-century, the human power to control the atom and to wreak large-scale destruction was an ongoing site of concern, and indeed remains so for the church. So too was the ability, and remains so, to control the foundations of life, not just the destruction of life, but the conditions of its creation. Hence the Catholic Church's concern about the cell, reproduction, genetics, genetic engineering, and more. I would say that the ongoing moral theme in the Catholic Church's official reflections on this topic has been the limits of human power over the bases of life. And the Catholic Church has sought in many different types of teachings, from moral theology to Catholic social thought, to amplify, to underscore the theme of respect for the dignity of the human person. There, of course, has been a massive amount of reflection in Catholic social ethics, Catholic social teaching, about the proper powers of the human being, our power for global destruction through nuclear war, and also in terms of genetic and reproductive and now environmental technologies. More about that shortly. Pope John Paul II and Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI were both extremely explicit about all of these kinds of risks in many of their encyclicals and many of their exhortations. During these years, and especially in around 2004, the International Theological Commission released several important documents on the role of the human and contemporary science, its dangers, its promise, the need to be technologically prudent. These topics have more recently been joined by an additional cohort of concerns about technology, human dignity, and human flourishing in a world of growing inequality and social degradation and environmental degradation. And this is where Pope Francis comes in. So this brings us to the fourth era of the Catholic Church's relationship with contemporary science. And that I am describing as ecology, technology, and interwoven degradations. Now, in my view, my professorial view, Laudato Si is Pope Francis's most recent and authoritative instance in which he articulates the Catholic Church's centuries-long relationship with science. In my view, he draws on themes from the three eras that I have noted prior and weaves them together in the contemporary context of that encyclical. He certainly draws directly upon his immediate predecessors, Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI and St. John Paul II, but he also draws upon these longer legacies that I have mentioned. Now, Laudato Si is not only about the environment. It is also not the first encyclical to express concern about the environment, nor to invoke the importance of nature. But Laudato Si is the first encyclical to centralize ecological questions. What, though, do we mean by ecology? Pope Francis, in Laudato Si, understands ecology not just as a branch of the environmental sciences. Here, he is drawing again on John Paul II and Benedict XVI. Ecology for Pope Francis, as for Benedict and for John Paul II, has to do with relationships. So it is that Benedict XVI spoke of the relationship between human ecology and natural or environmental ecology, the caliber of those relationships and how they mutually inform one another. Ecology for Pope Francis is all about relationships. It's about ethics. It has to do with the relationship between humans and God, humans and one another, and humans and the earth that sustains us. He argues that our common home is deteriorating and that too many societies are societies of exclusion that degrade life, both human and environmental. He is concerned about the disrespect for life that he sees going on across the spectrum, from before birth to end-of-life care, with environmental degradation, lack of concern for people with disabilities, lack of concern for the poor, and many others being part of this spectrum, of this web. So let me show you some points where Francis's encyclical draws forward themes from other eras that I've previously described. I have 3 such areas. The first is the role of Scripture and the careful revisability of its interpretation. The second is the importance of science. And the third is my favorite example that has to do with fresh water. I also want to articulate another one, which is concern about the misuse of technology. So again, the 3 are the role of Scripture and the revisability of its interpretation, the importance of science, including here as an example, my particular favorite topic, water, and then finally concern about the misuse of technology. All right, so the role of Scripture and the revisability of its interpretation. In chapter 2 of Laudato Si, Pope Francis speaks directly to Christians. In chapter 1, and in the introduction, he said that he's speaking to everyone on earth. But in chapter 2, he says, my fellow Christians, this is for you in a special way. What do we need to think about? What do we need to know? And one of the first things he addresses is scriptural interpretation, particularly Genesis passages that have provided some challenges throughout different eras of the church's relationship with science. And here's what Pope Francis says. He says, although it's true that we Christians have at times incorrectly interpreted the scriptures, nowadays we must forcefully reject the notion that our being created in God's image and given dominion over the earth justifies absolute dominion over other creatures. The biblical texts are to be read in their context, with an appropriate hermeneutic, recognizing that they tell us to till and keep the garden of the world. Tilling refers to cultivating, while keeping means caring, protecting, overseeing, and preserving. This implies a relationship of mutual responsibility between human beings and nature. Later, he says, this responsibility for God's earth means that human beings, endowed with intelligence, must respect the laws of nature and the delicate equilibria existing between the creatures of this world. So Pope Francis is responding to this idea that the Catholic Church has been overly focused on the human, this charge of anthropocentrism, human-focused behavior, moral priority. And he says, you know what? Sometimes the Catholic Church has embraced a dominion theology that becomes a theology of domination, a theology whereby humans are seen as able to do whatever they want to the earth, because we are the ones created in the image of God and everything else is put at our service. Stunningly, to me, Francis says, you know what? To the extent that the church has taught that, we've been wrong. Because a proper interpretation, knowing what we know now and looking back into tradition, is to say that dominion means tilling and keeping. It doesn't mean dominating. It doesn't mean exploiting. We are responsible for God's earth with our particular intelligence. Instead, we are turning it into, as he famously says later in the encyclical, a pile of filth. I settle on this passage because I want to underscore the point that the Catholic Church is in a consistent relationship with sciences of the times as it strives to better understand the meaning of Scripture in the world and in people's lives. This is not, again, to call into question the truths of Scripture. It is to better understand and illuminate Scripture in light of what we understand about nature. Because nature and human ability to understand it are important modes of knowledge, according to the Catholic Church. This leads us to the importance of science, including environmental science. Now, in the past 15 years alone, the Pontifical Academy of Sciences first founded in 1936, reconstituted a couple decades later. The Pontifical Academy of Sciences and its sibling, Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences, have convened summits on sustainability, economics, water, climate change, and other topics. The International Theological Commission has issued a document on natural law in an era of contemporary science. So what are some good quotes from Laudato Si on science and religion, and what do we make of them? Let me give you a few. First, from chapter 2, science and religion, with their distinctive approaches to understanding reality, can enter into an intense dialogue fruitful for both. So again, we do not see science as conflicting with theology or faith. We have the intense dialogue fruitful for both. They are not conflictual necessarily, nor do they occupy totally separate realms. They have possibility for intense and important dialogue. Indeed, says Pope Francis, if we are truly concerned to develop an ecology capable of remedying the damage we have done, no branch of the sciences and no form of wisdom can be left out, and that includes religion and the language particular to it. All of the resources of human knowledge, science, religion, values, ethics, need to be part of a conversation about steering the world towards healthier relationships. I think another notable thing about Laudato Si in terms of the value of science in theological reflection and moral reflection is the assumption that scientific consensus is trustworthy. In chapter 1 of the encyclical, for example, Pope Francis talks about how a very solid scientific consensus indicates that we are presently witnessing a disturbing warming of the climatic system. And he goes on to say, sure, there are many factors for this, but to the degree that there are anthropogenic, that is human-caused amplifications to baseline climate cycles, humanity, this is a quote, humanity is called to recognize the need for changes of lifestyle, production, and consumption in order to combat this warming, or at least the human causes which produce or aggravate it. There are other examples where Pope Francis talks about scientific consensus, and one that is near and dear to my heart, as I mentioned, is to do with fresh water. Now, I actually was born in Fresno in the Central Valley, and many of my relatives are from the Bay Area, so it's a region of which I'm very, very fond. And while there are, of course, many differences between the Central Valley and the Bay Area, it is the case that water is a constant topic of significant import. So when I read this encyclical, I noticed the ways in which Pope Francis talked about water. And in the years since 2015, when the encyclical was released, I've had the great pleasure of speaking with communities in the East Bay and in the Central Valley, some in religious contexts, some in ecumenical contexts, some in scholarly contexts, and learning a lot more about issues pertaining, say, to groundwater contamination in the Central Valley and how those disproportionately affect migrant families and people of color or people living in lower socioeconomic statuses. I've also learned a lot from those environmental justice organizations, many of which have Catholic Church links, especially in the Central Valley, about air quality and the effects of climate change. Obviously now you all are dealing with so much in terms of the fires and the intense suffering that has provoked, and the fear and the displacement. Water, to turn back to that example, is a site where Pope Francis draws on the science and infuses Catholic values. And I think this is really, when it boils down to it, what I love about thinking about the Catholic Church and science, because there's such a regard for developments of contemporary science, especially scientific consensus. And there is also the ability to speak of values, to speak of life-giving, dignity-sustaining values. So water is described by science and valued by humans, and valued especially by the Church in these ways. writes Francis, fresh water is an issue of primary importance since it's indispensable for human life and for supporting terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. Sources of fresh water are necessary for healthcare, agriculture, and industry. Water supplies used to be relatively constant, but now in many places demand exceeds the sustainable supply, with dramatic consequences in the short and long term. He goes on to describe water poverty and who that affects and why. And he adds, one particularly serious problem is the quality of water available to the poor. Everyday unsafe water results in many deaths and the spread of water-related diseases, including those caused by microorganisms and chemical substances. Think that's not theological? It's definitely scientific, but here's the theological infusion. Access to fresh water, writes Pope Francis, access to safe drinkable water is a basic and universal human right, since it is essential to human survival and as such is a condition for the exercise of other human rights. Our world has a grave social debt towards the poor who lack access to drinking water because they are denied the right to a life consistent with their inalienable dignity. You heard it, folks. Fresh water is a fundamental human right. It is a fundamental right because it is essential to the fulfillment of all other human rights. To living one's life in the God-given dignity with which we all are all bestowed, it is part, in fact, of a right to life framework, to allow people to live a life consistent with their inalienable dignity. Those are powerful theological and ethical words. If you're interested in this topic, I have written a book on it. It was published in 2014. Went to press actually just as Pope Francis had ascended to the papacy. And in that book, I described what I saw as the Catholic Church's movement toward a really robust theological and ethical set of values for fresh water. As it turns out, when Pope Francis came out with Laudato Si in 2015, those hypotheses were confirmed robustly. And so in 2018, I published a revised version of that book. It's called Just Water, Theology, Ethics, and Global Water Crises, published by Orbis Books, 2018. All right, the final category with regard to science and Laudato Si. And then don't worry, we're almost done. After this, it's conclusions and takeaways. The final section is concern about the misuse of technology. So you will recognize that this third of categories, along with the prior two in Laudato Si, resonate with prior eras of the Catholic Church's engagement with science. Right now, we're about to talk about concern of the misuse of technology. Before that, we were talking about respect for scientific consensus and the importance of science. And before that, the role of Scripture and the measured revisability of its interpretation in light of contemporary science. So let me conclude with this topic of technology and concern about its misuse. Now, in Laudato Si, Pope Francis quotes John Paul II and Benedict XVI all the time. A lot of respect for his predecessors, respect for tradition. Quoting John Paul II, he says, "Science and technology are wonderful products of a God-given human creativity. Technology itself expresses the inner tension that impels man gradually to overcome material limitations. This ability to imagine, to create, this is a proper, unique human power." He's quoting John Paul II directly here. He goes on to say, technology has remedied countless evils. Let's think about medicine. Let's think about engineering, communications. It's astonishing. This is in chapter 2, section number 102. But then he goes on to say the following, and this is a direct, extensive quote. "Yet it must also be recognized that nuclear energy, biotechnology, information technology, knowledge of our DNA, and many other abilities which we have acquired have given us tremendous power. More precisely, they've given those with the knowledge, and especially the economic resources to use them, an impressive dominance over the whole of humanity and the entire world. Never has humanity had such power over itself Yet nothing ensures that it will be used wisely, particularly when we consider how it is currently being used. We need to think of the nuclear bombs dropped in the middle of the 20th century, or the array of technology with which Nazism, communism, and other totalitarian regimes have employed to kill millions of people, to say nothing of the increasingly deadly arsenal of weapons available for modern warfare. In whose hands does all this power lie? Or will it eventually end up? It is extremely risky for a small part of humanity to have it. End quote. Section 104. Now, many of these themes are echoed in his more recent encyclical from just a few months ago, Fratelli Tutti, and I encourage you to think about those connections. And he goes on a little later, Pope Francis does, to say science and technology are not neutral. From the beginning to the end of a process, various intentions and possibilities are in play and can take on distinct shapes. Nobody is suggesting a return to the Stone Age, but we do need to slow down and look at reality in a different way, to appropriate the positive and sustainable progress that has been made, but also to recover the values and the great goals swept away by our unrestrained delusions of grandeur. That's section 114. Thus, Pope Francis is concerned about the scope of technological power without a value-laden ethical framework, without a conscious, theologically, spiritually, relationally accountable set of guidelines. Technology in itself can be harmful. Technology is not neutral. Technology can be used for great good, but it's only as good as the framework within which it is deployed. So he goes on to say that there are better and worse frameworks. He says, and this is quoting John Paul II again, "This then is the correct framework for any reflection concerning human intervention on plants and animals, which at present includes genetic manipulation by biotechnology. The respect owed by faith to reason calls for close attention to what the biological sciences, through research uninfluenced by economic interests, can teach us about biological structures, their possibilities, and their mutations." And he goes on to talk about limitations to intervention in natural creative processes. So within this fourth era of the Catholic Church's relationship to science, epitomized by Pope Francis in Laudato Si and other of his teachings, anticipated with groundwork laid by John Paul II and Benedict XVI, we have these three themes that I have drawn out. The one is the careful revisability of Scripture based on scientific knowledge. There is a dialogue. The second is the importance of scientific consensus and respecting it and drawing on it to illuminate ethical dilemmas, such as one that I pointed to in particular, the situation of fresh water. And the third is a carefulness and a skepticism about the rampant powers of technology, both nuclear, pertaining to war, and pertaining to biotechnology. So what should we conclude? Well, with Francis, we can conclude, section 199, that it cannot be maintained that empirical science provides a complete explanation of life, of the interplay of all creatures and the whole of reality. In other words, science is not a metaphysical or theological system. It is one way of knowing reality. It is one way of reading what the Catholic tradition has called the book of nature. But theology is here too. And the values, the insights, and the tradition of theological reflection must be in fruitful, sometimes intense dialogue, to quote Pope Francis, with the scientific reality as currently understood. So here are a few concluding remarks and questions. First, legacies from the four eras of the Catholic Church and science. One, of course, is the role of Scripture and this question of how it's interpreted. The generosity of interpretation of particular scriptural descriptions in light of contemporary science, while also maintaining to revealed truths about God, about human nature, about Jesus, the incarnation, etc. That is a really beautiful and important dance that the Catholic Church is quite uniquely, in my view, able to do. Second is this idea of the dialogue between religion and science. Now, at times, of course, that hasn't been a dialogue. With Galileo, it was pretty conflictual, as we discussed. There was a lot of tension between individuals who wanted to talk about evolutionary theory in theological ways and the Catholic Church in the late 1900s. I'm not trying to gloss over that, but I am saying that at present, looking back on this legacy, Popes John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and now Francis are very interested in the dialogue between religion and sometimes science, even if it is sometimes intense. There are proper domains. They don't identically overlap, but where they do overlap and describe varying aspects of reality is where that dialogue is both intense and fruitful. And again, I think that fresh water supply, the changing supply of it, the issues of pollution, as well as the social realities and the theological mandate to give drink to the thirsty, for example, overlap in really, really important ways that continue to generate important insights. I leave you with a couple questions. One is, where might you say, if you reflect on it, where might you say that the data of contemporary science or the stories science tells about human origins or the natural world, where has contemporary science somehow illuminated creation for you? Where and how has science illuminated creation for you? What kind of scientific descriptions might overlap with scriptural accounts and point toward God or the book of nature that Catholic theology has so long held to be theologically revelatory? And then finally, theology, of course, has its own truths, even as with Pope Francis and his predecessors, theology embraces insights from contemporary science. So my question is, where and how do you see theology in your understanding of the Gospels, of the Church, of sacramental life, of pastoral life? Where do you see theology offering resources to imagine and enact a world of flourishing for all? Thank you.